As many of you know, up until, May of last year, I was an American history teacher at a public high school here in the state of Texas. And as a public school teacher in the state of Texas, oftentimes, when you're sick, you're desperate for something for kids to do, and, we resort to leaving videos for our substitutes to show, maybe with assignments, maybe with study questions, maybe with, an essay assignment to go with it, but we leave videos for our students to watch. And one of the series I remember us having copies of in the history department at my high school was a series called The Men Who Built America. And essentially it was a look at industrialists and the impact industrialists had had on building the modern United States of America. It was about people like Jay Gould and Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and other wealthy industrialist men. And I will admit that there were times at which I think those videos were shown in my class, but it always bothered me that this was the title, The Men Who Built America, and it was only referring to these rich, wealthy, and even though they didn't necessarily start off that way, successful white men, and giving them credit for building the United States of America. And it wasn't really until relatively recently when I watched the debate that took place in 1965 at Oxford University between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley Jr. That it occurred to me why it bothered me so much, or part of the reason why it bothered me so much. And in that debate, as a part of that speech, I'll leave a link to that debate down below because I think it's well worth watching. No offense to William F. Buckley Jr. that he's not entitled to, but in the debate, he's on the wrong side, and there's no really point in looking at that. If you fast forward through the video about 20 minutes, you'll get to where Baldwin begins speaking. And in that speech, Baldwin says, and I'm paraphrasing, this is not a direct quote, he says, "I grew the cotton, and I picked the cotton, and I took the cotton to market. And I built the railroads, and I built the harbors." And he's referring to the fact that African American people did all that work. And he said later on, and my ancestors have been buried in the soil of the United States of America for hundreds of years. And yet, in 1965, and I think you could argue still today, he still was not considered by white America to be a full-blown citizen of the United States, despite all that he and African American people had done. And it occurred to me then, this is what bothers me about that Men Who Built America title and what it implies. Because, number one, it just overlooks the contribution of labor made by, people of any gender or people of any race or ethnicity. It just completely, dismisses them as though, labor isn't assumed and, that contribution is faceless and meaningless. But of course, in making that series, the series makers didn't even bother to look really for African American industrialists or inventors who made contributions to industry. And so, one of the things that occurred to me, one of the regrets I have as a retired teacher is I didn't do enough with Black History Month. So in some ways, this video and the others I'm planning on doing on Thursday for the rest of this month are an attempt, at some kind of, penance or compensation or apology for not doing more with Black History Month. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about how African Americans built the United States. Now, in saying this, I can say African Americans built the United States, and hopefully you'll understand, I'm not saying they did it by themselves. I'm not saying this to the exclusion of others, even though that's the way in which we talk about the people who built the United States. My grandfathers didn't come here and do, white people say that kind of thing all the time, and they exclude African Americans. I'm not excluding the others, but we need to focus, I think, on the contributions that African Americans have made to building the nation that we as Americans have hopefully healthy patriotic feelings about and feel that is a great nation and that we can be proud to be a citizen of. So in part this goes back to also then the 1619 Project, which quite innocently, I have to tell you, attempted to just commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved people from Africa arriving in the American colonies, specifically in Virginia. So that's kind of where I want to start. I want to start off with that, and then I want to, as quickly as I can, get us to contributions made by African Americans up through World War II. Because if we're thinking about building America, we have to begin at the beginning, which colonizations, and then build to the point where we achieved pretty much what we are today. whatever that is, good or bad. So I wanted to talk about that really quickly. So the first thing you understand, I think, about the contributions African Americans make is that, yes, oftentimes African Americans made these contributions unwillingly, kidnapped, forced onto slave ships where they died by the thousands on trips over to the Americas, sold into slavery, their kids, their families sold into slavery, their lives treated like they were expendable by the people who purchased them and used their lives and labor up, not for the benefit of the people doing the work, but for the benefit of who owned them. This is all true. That labor might be unwillingly given. That doesn't mean it wasn't instrumental in creating the United States of America, and Virginia is the place to start with that. The reason why so many enslaved people were brought to Virginia from Africa was tobacco. And without the cheap labor provided by enslaved African Americans in Virginia, the tobacco economy of Virginia and Maryland and Delaware never would have existed. And it's that tobacco economy which caused the growth of the American colonies in the first place. That was the first true wealth. That is where wealth came from. Remember, in 1619, the Pilgrims hadn't landed in Massachusetts in 1619 when the first African American slave people came here, and they were quickly put to work in growing the thing that would grow the best in Virginia, and that was tobacco. And tobacco was an incredibly valuable cash crop, so valuable in fact that the economy of Virginia and Maryland and Delaware depended on tobacco. Good tobacco year, good economy. Bad tobacco year, bad economy. In a place where there was a lack of money in those colonies, tobacco could actually be used as cash. This much tobacco could actually buy you the goods and other things that you needed. In South Carolina, we had an economy, a plantation economy based on rice. And enslaved African Americans went to South Carolina and they grew and harvested rice and allowed for the growth of Charleston, the development of the colony of South Carolina. They drained swamps in both places. They built levees. They built irrigation systems. They cleared fields. They planted, they processed, they built roads and bridges. They created the infrastructure that the colony needed. Dock facilities and harbors, they helped create the infrastructure the colonies needed to take advantage of these cash crops, tobacco and rice. In the Northeast, in the New England colonies in the Northeast, the African American population there grew more slowly because the economies of those places weren't and didn't develop a dependence on cheap slave labor. But African Americans still went there and contributed to the economy. In the fishing industry in the Northeast, African American men, free and enslaved, worked on fishing boats. They worked on the docks, loading and unloading. They made rope, they made barrels, they built dock facilities, they cleared lumber and cut down trees for the process of building. They took on innumerable other jobs, and even with their own bodies, they created economic growth in the American colonies because the slave markets in New York City and Charleston and other places generated wealth for the American colonial people. And without that labor, the American colonies are not profitable. Look at the other colonies of other European nations and why they were less successful. Why aren't the French more successful? Why do the Dutch have to give up New Amsterdam? And it's because they could not attract enough people to the colonies to make a go of it. But the English colonists could, and in part because they found these cash crops, and in part because they were willing to take advantage of enslaved labor. So literally, enslaved people created the foundation of the United States economy, from which the population of the American colonies grew, and from which the economy and created this basis of the American colony. When we fast forward, into the 1820s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and we see the expansion of the United States to the west, up to and just beyond the Mississippi River, in particular in the South, the cotton economy comes into existence, and that leads to an explosion of the internal slave trade within the United States and the development of true and massive wealth from growing cotton. And again, it's the African Americans picking that cotton and processing that cotton that makes that economic growth possible, and that affects the North as well. Think back to your history of industrialization, and if I were to ask you what were the first real industries that existed in European in Western civilization, for lack of a better term, you'll find that textile industries were in England and here in the United States as well. In England, the textile industry focused began by focusing on wool and processing wool. But here in the United States, that wasn't true. What did the textile mills that began to open up in the New England states and in the Northeast, what did they process? They processed cotton, they made yarn, they made fabric, and even industrialization depended on this labor, on the labor of African Americans in the American South. It was African American labor that cleared the fields and expanded and pushed the borders of the United States to the west, particularly in the South, but elsewhere, whether again the labor was voluntary or not. African Americans participated in that. It was African American labor that helped to build the Erie Canal, which connected the Hudson River and New York City to the great interior of North America, making New York into a major port city. There was an African American man who traveled as a slave of William Clark, who traveled with the Lewis and Clark expedition and made it as a part of the voyage of discovery all the way to the West Coast, all the way to the Pacific Coast of what will become the United States, expanding American claims to that territory. You know, African Americans played a role in all these things and all these events we consider to be fundamental and foundational to the United States. During the American Revolutionary War, African Americans served in the United States military. A regiment from Rhode Island was an all African American regiment, relatively small, but earned a good reputation for being a hard-fighting and excellent military organization. During the Civil War, African Americans enlisted by the hundreds of thousands in the Union Army to fight specifically to bring slavery to an end. They may not have fought in combat in large numbers, even though some did. They fought and they died alongside white soldiers from northern states and from the Union as well. But they built fortifications, they dug trenches, they buried the dead. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, it was African American labor which kept the Southern economy going through the awful slavery replacement system known as sharecropping. Enduring the violence and hardship of Jim Crow and racism and segregation in the South. African American men went west with the United States Army and were formed into military units which were known as, and they were called Buffalo Soldiers, which were all African American military units which went west and helped the United States government destroy the civilizations of Native Americans. And notice that African Americans do participate in the colonial settler process the United States goes through. I would just point out that African Americans oftentimes, while African Americans are descended from people who came here involuntarily and were victims of that system themselves, that doesn't mean they didn't take part in it. African Americans after the Civil War came to Texas and became cowboys, participated in the cattle drive. African Americans after the Civil War moved to Kansas, where they homesteaded and made farms and were referred to as exodusters and helped to create a new farming economy for the United States. And increasingly after the Civil War, African Americans began moving north and participating in industrialization and providing, again, low-cost labor on which industrialization truly depended. That means that African Americans participated in or were employees of the very people who are in that Men Who Built America series, where they worked in the steel industry, where they worked on the railroad industry, and as Pullman porters. I mean, the importance, by the way, of African American Pullman porters throughout this great age of railroad in terms of the civil rights movement, in terms of what they contributed to the growth of the United States is one of those things I think is far too often underestimated its importance. They participated in and worked in the automobile industry, and they were miners, and they did all the things, all the labor jobs you can think of that go along with this industrialization. African Americans also participated in that work. During World War II, African Americans moved in even greater numbers to places like Detroit and to California and the West Coast, where, in addition to the fact that millions of African Americans served in uniform during World War II, African Americans worked in the defense industry, building the ships, the tanks, the machine guns, the airplanes that the United States and the Allies used to defeat fascism. African Americans helped to rid the world of fascism in American military uniforms while facing fascism back home. African American contributions to the development, growth, and building the United States are far too often underappreciated contribution by a group of people who believed in a system, an economic system, a political system that oftentimes didn't believe in them and didn't believe in their equality. Anyway, I just want to start off my series on during Black History Month by talking about this subject in just kind of a general way, Let me know what you think about it in the comment section down below, and as always, thank you for watching.